Welcome to the Nissan Maxima case study. This case study was submitted by John Thornton to our PTS program. The vehicle in question is a 1997 Nissan Maxima with a 3-liter VQ30DE engine. It's listed at 157,000 miles. The work order shows a complaint of hard to start. It can mean a number of different things, so John decides to contact the customer directly, to which she responds that every so often it does not want to start. So what he is faced with now is an intermittent hard start complaint. His diagnostic process is to prepare the vehicle ahead of time so that he does not spend as much time under the hood. To that end, he's left the vehicle sitting outside overnight to ensure that it is physically cold. It's then pushed into the bay. A fuel pressure gauge is connected to it. Prior to this, he already has his schematics printed out from his service information. And as part of his initial check, he connects a low amp current probe around the coil-over-plug primary feed wire. As we can see in this photograph, the power feed for the coil-over-plug ignition system is in red, and it's in relatively close proximity to the fuel injector feed circuit. In this photograph, we see the low amp current probe connected around the ignition feed circuit. At this point, John begins cranking the engine. At about 5 seconds into the recording here, we can see the ignition current pulses. The notation on the screen here is that the cranking RPM is even. When this is correct, we get regularly spaced, even width current pulses in that circuit. What we're seeing here is something that's obviously incorrect. To provide further information, John decides to open the jaws and insert the injector feed wire into the low amp current probe so he can view injector current and ignition current on the same screen. This screen indicates injector current, which is highlighted in yellow, occurring at regular intervals with consistent widths. The ignition current is occurring at wildly varying intervals and varying widths. This is characteristic of an ignition system that is being mistriggered. Another indicator that John has here is that there should be 3 coil-over-plug firing events between each injector group firing. And while we may see in certain instances that there are 3 firing events, the coil-on time and the timing of those events is varying considerably. At this point, John decides to add the number 1 injector trigger signal to the mix to help more clearly identify the injector current pulses. As you can see in the photograph, the connection in this case is relatively easy. He's connected to the ground side of the number 1 injector. In this scope capture, the red trace indicates the number 1 injector voltage. The downward transition indicates an on command, the upward transition indicates the off command, and those on-off commands tie directly into injector current pulses in the blue trace below. The ignition pulses occur outside of the injection pulses and, as you can see from this capture, vary wildly. John's direction at this point is that the primary ignition current is very erratic. The firing frequency and the dwell control are obviously incorrect, so that there is something involved in the system that's causing the PCM to inaccurately trigger the primary ignition circuit. Based on prior experience, John decides to look at starter current at the same time. As part of this, he connects a high amp current probe around the negative battery cable. We can see that high amp current probe right next to the battery in this case, and the low amp current probe is still in place. As he cranks the engine, in this scope pattern, we can see the injector voltage identified in the red trace, injector current and ignition voltage are indicated in the blue trace, and starter current is indicated in the green trace. There are two characteristics of the starter current that bear investigation. The overall peaks and valleys that you see here are indications as to piston position in the cylinder. As the piston comes up towards top dead center on compression, the starter draw increases. As it goes beyond top dead center, the starter current decreases. So what we're seeing in the overall peaks and valleys of the starter current pattern are consistent with compression events. The other characteristic that bears investigation here are the very regular dropouts in current. If you look at the scale along the left side of the screen there, consistently starter current drops to below 35 amps. This should not occur in a normally operating starter. John's analysis continues in that he recognizes that this engine uses two crankshaft position sensors. One of them is a reference sensor mounted to the front of the engine. The other is a position sensor mounted on the bell housing. The position sensor trigger teeth are mounted on the engine side of the flywheel drive gear teeth. So based on this information, John elects to add the rear crank position sensor signal to the mix. The connection is very easy to make, as there is a connector for this on the front side of the engine. Here we have the scope pattern. Ignition primary current and injector current is identified by the blue trace. Starter current is identified by the green trace. Injector voltage is identified in the red trace. The position sensor signal to the PCM is indicated by the orange trace. In analyzing this scope pattern, we can see that there are some characteristics in the starter current that appear to be creating anomalies in the position sensor signal. At this point, that is more of a suspicion than it is hard fact. The next step then is for John to crank the engine while monitoring those four traces. And as you can see in this screen capture, at time point 4580, he releases the ignition switch from the start position to the run position. The starter current drops to 0, and at that point the position sensor signal becomes very, very clean, much more like the square wave that it should be. The conclusion from this is the anomalies in the starter current are inducing anomalies into the position sensor signal going to the PCM, causing the PCM to mistrigger the ignition system. In this photograph, we can see the proximity of the starter to that position sensor itself. They're located within a couple of inches of each other. So John's conclusion at this point is that the starter is failing or has failed. So he replaces the starter motor, services the battery and the connections. The electrical noise created by the starter motor was the root cause of the hard start concern, because it created erratic and inaccurate ignition pulses. The points to remember out of this case study: John's philosophy is to prepare his diagnosis before actually beginning to work on the vehicle. That means getting the vehicle under the conditions that are present when it's hard to start, printing out his service information before he begins, and having a fairly well-developed plan of attack. The other point to remember in this case study is that high current fluctuations can affect the output signal of magnetic pickups. Those fluctuations can cause the PCM to wildly mistrigger certain devices.